Hello, friends. I'm no therapist, but I'm your host, Stephanie Goodman. I'm a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a woman of faith. Often friends ask me how I have a successful marriage while blending families and staying optimistic in life. This podcast features people with real-life stories about success in relationships and triumph over trial. Grief cannot be ignored, but with the right tools, we can go through it and come out the other side a stronger, more self-aware person. My guest, Travis Nilsson, author of the book Questions of the Soul, talks about his grief from growing up in an abusive household to being bullied and losing loved ones. But he also shares with us personal examples of healing through mindful thinking, positive changes, and grieving with a purpose. I would like to introduce to you a dear friend of mine. His name is Travis Nilsson, and he is the author of, and I'm going to read it to make sure I get it correctly, Questions of the Soul, Grieving, Healing, and Finding Meaning After Loss. And I'm so grateful that Travis is willing to share his personal experiences and some of the lessons that he's learned in hopes to maybe carry you through a situation that might be similar, or you may know someone who's going through such a process. And I'm very excited to introduce him to you. Travis, welcome to my show. And tell me, what inspired you to write this beautiful book about questions of the soul? I love that title, by the way.
Yeah, well, thanks. I did some thinking on it. So the general concept of the book is people are going through grieving things, like just a bunch of stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And I've been through a fair share of grief myself. And sometimes we grieve about things we don't even realize it's happening about half the time when it's happening. So the book is I draw from a lot of personal experiences, because despite looking younger than the 31 that I am, I've been through my fair share of trauma, my fair share of grief and things like that. But unless I were to tell someone, they wouldn't know, because I don't wear it on my sleeve, because
Right.
I have moved through it. I've learned how to move through it.
Ooh, that's powerful.
And so the book is the premise of it is each chapter asks a question that someone, whether it be audibly or in their heart or in their mind, ask themselves about grief. So like, well, why do we feel grief? What is grief? What are the stages of grief? Because that's kind of a concept that's been out there for a while, stages of grief. But then I also not only go over my own personal stories, but various exercises or contributions that someone can kind of go through. Say like, someone says, oh, like they're feeling really overwhelmed. They're in the grocery store. They see their spouse's favorite cereal, and bam, they're having an episode about grief. And like, what do we do with these kinds of things, right? So I talked about different exercises and things like that. And
so action steps, really.
Yeah, a lot of different action steps, but motivated by my own personal stories. Cool. Yeah, so I kind of weave those in there.
Yeah, and I think that we can relate to some of those situations. I mean, we are living in this life, right? And this life will give us opportunities of growing through some hard things, some hard times.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, and that's another thing that I go over in my book a little bit about is it doesn't just have to be grieving death. So it's a little bit broader of a book. In fact, the topics that I cover, each one of them could probably be a whole book, but I simply am not that great of a writer to do that. There's the time.
Yeah.
There's those kinds of things. So I dip into a bunch of different things. So I talk about grieving through unemployment as an example. I talk about grieving through loss of living relationships. Okay. So, losing a friend and losing touch, and we grieve those things,
yes,
whether
we do.
realize it or not. So that's the basic premise of the book, and some of the things that I have.
I'm really impressed that you have, first of all, achieved a level of taking your own personal stories at 31, and you have published a book. How many of us, even at my age, look and say, my goodness, how do I publish a book, right? How do I tell my story? How do I be vulnerable?
Yeah. Well,
And
you
you've
want
done
to,
it.
right? You want to
Yes,
write
I
a book.
do. Yes,
So,
I do.
you know, it's, I mean, I can't speak to the writing process as much because it's different for everyone.
Yeah.
But that I've known because of my story, because of some of the things that I've been through, I've always known that I wanted to share it in some way, shape, or form through a medium. And the book is just the first way that I did that.
So Travis, tell me about growing up.
Yeah, so growing up, I had 3 parents, right? So my mom, she's still alive, thankfully, and then my adopted father. And that was kind of the bulk of my parental unit throughout most of my life. But I did have early childhood with a fellow named John Freitag. So he was my biological father. And there's just a lot of stuff, talking about grief that he had contributed to my life just by way of who he was as a person.
Okay. And triggers.
Oh, yeah.
Huge.
Yeah. I mean, but like I stated at the beginning, I worked through most of those.
Wow.
I would be grasping at straws to be able to say, oh, this is triggering and setting me back. And for that reason, that's why I feel comfortable being as vulnerable as what I have, right, to share my story, both here as well as written. But yeah, so growing up with John as my biological father, so he was not straight-laced by any means. He was an alcoholic, he would smoke indoors with young children, right? Because I would have been the years of before 6, right?
Okay.
Wow. And despite that, I actually have pretty solid memories for
being so
young. And I think it's due to that trauma piece that you said.
Okay.
That trauma kind of flashbulbed it in my memory. Even though I don't really have as much of an emotional reaction from them, I have a lot of very vivid memories, right? Okay. So again, smoking indoors is an example. Like I remember walking around the house and seeing cigarette butts on the banister. Boop, 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 just lined up like that, right? And they'd just be there, doop, 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 sometimes still smoking. So this is the kind of person he was, and he was into illegal drugs, and he would use pharmaceuticals recreationally. And this is long before the opioid epidemic, so he was that kind of a person. I mean, I have memories about my so I have 2 half brothers who are twins. I'm not going to say their names because I don't know how
to protect the
innocent. Yeah, I don't know how open they would be to me sharing much about them on this podcast.
Okay.
But Dad would come home with women and go into his bedroom and close the door. Now, being young, I didn't know what that meant. But my brothers had enough knowledge that when Dad comes home and goes in there with the lady and closes that door, you do not disturb, right? Well, they were mischievous somewhat, and they said, hey, I remember I just really needed to ask Dad something. I was like, I really gotta ask my dad this thing. And I can't remember what it was, the thing, but I remember that it was urgent.
Important.
Whatever it was, in the mind of 4 or 5-year-old, this was an urgent matter.
Beyond anything else.
Yeah. And my brothers go, hey, you should go over there and knock on his door. Right? So I go over and knock on his door, and nothing, because he's being intimate.
Busy.
Yeah. And so I go over there, knock on his door, and then no answer. And my brothers, and I go, he's not answering the door, but I got it. And they say, well, try again. And I go and try again, and nothing. And then they say, just go in there, they say. And so I do.
Innocently?
And innocently. And the door's unlocked.
Oh,
and
dear.
I walk in on a scene. And I remember him being so mad. Anyone would be, whether they're a virtuous person or not. Yeah. Anyone would be upset at that kind of a thing.
That exposure, yeah. Okay.
And so I walk it, but I remember he was so mad, and then that's kind of where that memory stops. But I have a lot of different kinds of puzzle pieces like that. So that was, that was just one of those memories. I remember and forgive me if I'm just kind of rambling, but these are some of the stories. I don't know that I actually shared that one in my book because it didn't really have as much. I actually think it's kind of funny. You know, it's a little bit humorous, but it helps you to understand my dad's character, that this was in the middle of the day. This wasn't at night. This was in the middle of the day, right? So it kind of helps you to understand his character a little bit. That's why I share that one. I mean, I have memories of being brought to strange homes in the middle of the night and having anxious feelings, not knowing, why did Dad wake me up and my brothers to take us here? And then upon arrival, putting us in a closed, like a small dark space, could have been a closet, could have been a room, I don't know. And then giving us cough medicine, like just like the tablets, but to make us drowsy, right? Like that was the intent, to make us drowsy so that we would stop bugging him or stop coming out. And then giving us very strict instructions, do not come out, right? So growing up, that memory in and of itself, as a boy, is a little strange. You know, it's got a little interesting feeling to it. There's like something ominous about it, but I didn't really know what that meant. But then looking back, knowing the kind of character that he was doing drugs. And he brought us along with him to do drugs. And he was abusive as well, and so there's some of that I was a recipient of. Not as bad as my mom. She was kind of a saint in taking the brunt of it for all of the children, right? But that I was there seeing these things happen, right? I was seeing them. I was hearing the yelling. I was hearing the screaming, you know. And although I don't have any specific memories tied to those things, you better believe I remember what it feels like to be around it, right?
Right.
So John, eventually my mom gets to a point where she says, enough is enough. I'm not going to take it. And I remember the morning my mom ran away with me. And I couldn't have been more than 2.5 or 3 years old when this happened, because I was young enough that I remember I had red and blue underpants and my mom had to dress me, right? So I had to be 1.5, 2 years old. And my mom has shared, that's about how old you were when that happened. So John had a habit of going out at night, again, you know, doing his drugs and drinking and not coming home, you know, or coming home and then taking out whatever drove him to do that on my mom, right? Well, she decides she has enough, and then my memory starts and I pick up. It was morning and my mom is running around kind of sporadically, frantically, and I could tell something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. Maybe my mom was crying, maybe that tipped me off, something like that, but that she was definitely frantic and overwhelmed about something. And I was in tuned enough to be able to ask her what it was, right? I remember asking, Mom, what's going on? What, you know, like in what little language I could.
At 2 years old.
You know, and maybe I didn't say words, but I certainly remember feeling this or attempting, you know, because again, 2 years old, like you don't have command of language too much by that young. You know, I have a 2-year-old at home myself. You know, her command of language isn't as great, right? Anyway, but I remember certainly being like, that was curious to me, and that it was kind of a mode of being I hadn't seen my mom in before, and that was part of the reason why it was so interesting to me. Well, my mom throws together a bunch of things in a basket, and she has me under one arm and the basket under the next, and we're out. And she went to a women's shelter that morning. She was running away to a women's shelter. Now, I didn't know that at the time, and my memory really stops at being concerned, and it stops at being in the morning and having my mom dress me and then like run around like crazy. That's kind of where my memory stops. But then fielding this by my mom and sharing this after the fact, she says, that was the morning I ran away with you. And so, and then thankfully she was able to find just a great husband. She remarried after a few years, but I was still John's son. So I would have to go back, right? But it put me in a really interesting position, because I remember being in a home that was very stable, with very loving mother and very loving stepfather who later adopted me. And growing up with him was incredible. I mean, the best dad, especially comparing to my first 6 years of life, right?
Yeah.
He was the best dad, and still is just a great, great father. I love him. But I was put in an interesting spot because I could feel that love. I could feel that care. I could feel the acceptance of just me growing up and being a little boy and putting up with little boys making a mess and doing stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And then going back to John every so often when he would show up to take me, which didn't happen as, what really was a blessing, right? But when he would show up to take me, I remember going back to my dad, John, and being overcome with darkness is the only way that I can express the feeling. And that it was palpable, the difference was. Even though I was so young, I could tell a difference. And which is amazing for me to think about that. Wow, not just speaking of myself, but little ones in general, they know a thing or two, and they can feel things that way, right? Mm-hmm. In a way that we don't know. And the only reason I have that is because that has stuck in my memory. I remember asking my mom one day coming back from she came to pick me up at night, and then asking her, why does it feel so good to be around Darren, but it doesn't feel good to be around John? Oh. And then imagine being a parent and having to explain that.
Yes.
Wow. She's a good lady. She's a good lady. Got me through a lot.
But I think that it's good for us to go down this road with you of discovering what you experienced and how it's affected your life now.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I remember once I had my two half brothers. They were twins. Again, mischievous, but just in the way that little kids are, like nothing inherently evil or wrong about them.
Okay.
But they, in recalling, they must have seen my dad kick back a pill or two, because I remember we stumbled upon his stash, and then in seeing him do it, they were encouraging me to do it, and they were trying to do it too. Oh. Trying to take whatever pills it was. Uh-huh. And the only reason that I know that it was for sure some sort of prescription pill stash is because, those bright orange bottles with those white labels, and they've never changed for
this is
50,
true.
60 years, it's always been that way.
Yeah.
And that stands out clear as day in my mind.
Okay.
About and the taste of oranges, interestingly enough, that I remember chomping down on one of these pills, and I think it was probably just like an acidic,
penicillin.
or some sort of acidic flavor or something.
Okay.
Right? Because, but that, in my little mind, I associated that with oranges. And midway into this, being encouraged to take another one or whatever, and I think they were too. Midway through this, I remember being asked audibly, and I associate it as one of my brothers, although I don't know that it was them, but I was audibly asked, Travis, is this good? And then I remember taking a moment and stopping and going, no, this isn't good. And then I responded to the question verbally, no, this isn't good. And then I must have ran off and played or something. I don't remember that. But that moment sticks with me, this idea of, is this good? Just that one question. Is this good? And then to be able to take some pause and stop and think. There's been, even still today, there are so many moments that I face where is this good? Travis, is this good?
Yeah.
I have to, and so that's persisted with me.
That's powerful.
I believe that it was God speaking to me. And again, it was audible to me. And so that was, just really interesting he thought it would be funny to give me a beer and see how I would react, so young, and say, try this is great, like, and he's with his buddies and they're over there laughing in the corner.
Yeah.
Of course they're off their rocker themselves, having drunk a few, and then he gives me, and then I do, because what do you do? Your dad gives you and says it's great. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I had tried alcohol. Luckily I never fell into alcoholism by way of addiction or anything like that, although I certainly could have with my background. And I remember it tasting so funny, and I didn't like it because and I don't drink today, but I understand that it can be an acquired taste,
Okay.
And so with that being my first exposure, as young as what I was just like, this is great. And then I remember saying, this is really strange root beer, to my dad, because he called it what it was. He called it beer, right to my face.
And who's
try this beer, but I didn't have a concept for that was that I had never had it before, but I had root beer.
Yeah.
So I take a sip and I'm like, and then he laughs and he says, I say, this root beer tastes funny. He says, isn't it good? And then I was like, I guess it is. I took another sip. But then he takes it from me because I guess he had some kind of a standard. Although giving beer to children is questionable to begin with. But so I have memories like that, and when I was being bounced back and forth between Darren and none of this is chronological, by the way. So for listeners or viewers, none of this is chronological. This is all just kind of as memory is. This is just the way it works. But I remember one time, I was feeling particularly saucy, maybe that's the word, I don't know. But I was mad at my dad.
Okay.
And I had just watched Home Alone. And in Home Alone, there's this line where he says, I'd rather kiss a toilet seat than something, something, something. Right?
Yeah.
Well, I was mad at my dad, and I look him right in his eyes and I say, I'd rather kiss a toilet seat than be your son. And you better believe, so he took me pretty forcefully by the arm into the mudroom and grabbed the first thing that he could find. And in this case, it was a used paint stirring stick, like those little, foot long.
Small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Little, and just put it in the can. And yeah, so he just took it just first thing and then just started wailing on me because I had said something so offensive to him, right? But I only thought to say it because I was being bounced around between a loving, kind, caring, fatherly figure and then someone not so much, right? Mm-hmm. And so I have these kinds of memories.
You were young, but you were feeling the difference, the yin and the yang, maybe.
Yeah, and I was confused by it, and it didn't make sense to me, even though I did have my mom to say, hey, the reason why you're feeling this way is because Darren is a good man, he lives a good life, and John has a little left to be desired there. As tenderly as she could, she never turned me against my biological father, which is very, reputable of my mom.
Yeah.
To have never turned me against. I did it on my own. I put two and two together.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think that's best too.
And I saw that, and so something I do talk about in my book is because of John's riotous lifestyle, eventually push came to shove, and he was murdered because of it. And so.
And you were how old when he was murdered?
I was 5 turning 6. So he was murdered in October of 1996. And what had happened was John, so he obviously had inroads with not very good people. I don't know that he was ever in a gang or anything like that, but he was in and around people that were in gangs and some sort of a drug dealing line and this kind of stuff. So he was in and around this kind of people. And he had a confrontation with a fellow who was in John's house partying, smoking weed, things like that. But John wasn't there at the time. He was visiting his family in Vegas. He was visiting his mom and dad. Well, a fellow friend called John up and said, hey, they're partying over here and smoking weed. And then John said, well, turn the phone over. And then he berates this dude and says, you need to get out of my house. Right. Mind you, John was living in government-assisted housing. He didn't make enough to be able to make ends meet, and what he did make, he spent. And so, with those kinds of things, if they find out you're doing that kind of stuff, which he had anyways on his own time, but if you find out that, they kick you out. They take away your assistance, they kick you out, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so he had told this fellow to leave, and the guy was so mad, and he was so mad, and then he left the house, and he slammed the door so hard that it fell off its hinges. Right?
Wow.
So that's kind of the inciting argument that led to John's demise. And then it kind of evolved, and John would call him and be like, you need to come over here and fix my mother whatever door. And they'd be after each other. And then, push came to shove, and eventually John started to get the police involved. And he reached out to the police to become an informant for them. And which John had connections. So that would have been a good informant for the police to have. And he started threatening the other fellow with this. Says, "Oh, I took it to the cops. I'm going to be an informant." This kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Except for that John went through with it. Like, now we're going back into my memories. I have distinct memories of being at John's house and then hearing the police on the message machine and being frightened by this and grabbing my inflatable pool toy and running and hiding behind a chair while my dad's listening to this message from the police. Which in and of itself should tell you something, that the police were meant to be feared, not respected in the way that I was being raised, right? Because you would imagine with John's lifestyle,
that brings in trauma whenever they're around.
Yeah. And so
yeah, and with his lifestyle, they were the bad guys.
Yeah, they were. They would have been the ones to throw him in jail, right?
Yeah.
And so, but he decided to side with him, become an informant, and then so I have that memory, and then afterwards I've read news articles and things like this just to find out a little bit more, and then that's when I came to find out that there was an officer that went on testimony during the murder trial that said yes, John was an informant. So that means that he went all the way through with this thing. He was really trying to, I guess, hit this other guy where it hurt, but in, I guess, a self-righteous way, or perhaps misguided, he was rubbing it in the other person's face.
Okay.
I'm an informant, I'm going to get you, whatever. So then I remember the night that John went into hiding, and this is another memory, not from the book, but just a memory, that he was dyeing his hair jet black, and he even went so far as to dye his eyebrows and his facial hair, his mustache, jet black as well, to try and match.
Which was originally
a darker brown, so darker than me.
Okay.
Yeah, a darker brown.
So to go jet black
it was a pretty significant
striking.
change, yeah. And I remember going in there and John being afraid when he was doing this, and he was getting help from someone else, I can't remember who. But I remember him being afraid, and I remember feeling it was palpable. This fear was palpable. And so then I went and I asked him, why are you doing this? What's wrong? But I don't remember his response, and that's really where my memory ends. But then after the fact, again, putting these pieces together, I told my mom, she goes, oh, that was probably him, like the night of him going into hiding, because this other guy was making so many death threats to him, just constantly calling the phone, constantly on the line with him, constantly, and if not on the phone personally, through shared acquaintances. Oh, he's telling me he's going to kill you. He's serious about it. He's serious.
That's awful.
And
that's heavy.
Yeah, it's heavy. Well, and the other guy was serious. There was one night, I guess push came to shove, and he went to John's house with some friends, just a bunch of friends, and then one of them had a gun on him, and then they are pounding on John's door. You come out right now. We're gonna da. From what I understand, the case notes in the case say that the friends thought that they were just gonna beat John up real good, give him a little fear of God, beat the crap out of that guy. That's what they thought they were doing.
Yeah.
But the conspirator had other plans. So then John comes to the door, sees what's going on, and he's going, oh, something tips John off. And so he tells him to wait. I don't know why they waited if they wanted to beat him up, but they did, I guess. Because then he had enough time to run in the house, and he grabbed his crossbow and a handful of bolts. And then that's when they saw John next, in an attempt to defend himself, because he, you know, like, he knew what was going on. And then next thing you know, these fellows pull a gun out on him. And the one that pulled the gun, I imagine the one that pulled the gun, because again, this is a friend of the person who really has beef with John. And I'm just extrapolating here. I haven't talked to this person, but I imagine he's also scared of John, because this guy's got a weapon with projectiles. And so they're both afraid of each other, trying to defend. And then the fellows, you know, he pulls out a gun and then looks over at his friend and says, "Should I shoot him? Should I shoot him?" And then they go, yes, shoot it, you know, shoot. And then they shoot him and they kill John on his doorstep. And then, so I would have been, I was 5 turning 6 when that happened. So I grew up with a lot of crazy trauma. I mean, just crazy stuff.
What was that like when you got the news that your dad had been murdered?
It was interesting. So, which is not the response you expect someone to say about that, but the reason why it was interesting is because I remember feeling a lot of mixed emotions. So, on the one side, this is my biological father, and there's some semblance of love or familial contact, or, you know, like, you know, this obligation, you know. And it's not that, like, I mean, there was some good in there, right? Like, I'm saying this like it was all bad all the time, right? There was some good in there. I just can't remember it, but there was some good in there. Mm-hmm. You know, like my half brothers, they do have good memories.
Okay. And
they will share good memories. So I know that there was some good in there, right? It just wasn't so for me. And so I had these really mixed opinions and thoughts, and I, in the end, was kind of happy, actually. And the reason why is because I got a sense of conclusion to say, oh, like, I don't have to be jerked back and forth between somewhere that feels good to be in and somewhere that feels horrible to be in.
Sure.
You know, just pure darkness.
Yeah.
There was a resolution to that.
Okay.
There was also resolution to, because at that point it was hit and miss whether John would actually come and pick me up on his weekends. So there's a sense of resolution to that too.
That would be stressful.
Yeah.
And not knowing, is he going to show up, and then what's going to happen when I have to go to Dad's house?
Yeah. And so there's some resolution to those feelings too.
Yeah.
And I think another reason why I felt so many mixed feelings and almost happy, which sounds callous to say, but, and I do say this in my book, I had grieved his life. I didn't need to grieve his death, because I had grieved his life. Yeah. And I had grieved being a part of his life. Mm-hmm. So any of those feelings of deep-seated grief, I had already been through. I had been going through it my whole life up to that point, right?
Yeah.
And so, in a way, I felt that sense of resolution. I felt a little bit happy because I didn't have to go through that anymore, you know. And so that was interesting to me. Well, and the other thing that it enabled me to do is in that time I had grown quite an attachment to my adopted father, but because John, my biological father, was still around, he refused to sign any kind of paperwork allowing my adopted father to officially adopt me, despite repeated requests, right? And so what that meant was I could be adopted by like my true fatherly figure, right? And he is my dad. Like, again, most of my life has been with him, right? This story that I'm telling you really is the first 6 years of my life. But here's the unfortunate thing, is that there are so many people that go through this kind of a thing that I've been through. And even if it is just those 6 years of their life, they cannot get out of it. They go to therapy, or they end up in jail themselves. Like, statistically speaking, if you're raised that way, you live that way. Even if it's just for those 6 years. And so it is a miracle,
Wow.
honestly and truly, that I did not end up in that lifestyle. That I did not end up committing petty theft or doing drugs or an alcoholic. Although I did develop an addictive personality that I have to be careful of. Like
Okay.
I can be easily addicted to things.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you think that that's trauma associated?
Perhaps I don't know that I've cared to dig enough into it to know. I think maybe a little bit of that addictive personality is due to just like biological, like just biology part of it. But then I do think how I was brought up had part of it, has a heavy hand in it too.
Yeah.
Because seeing someone act constantly in addicted ways all the time, like always out at the bar, always smoking, always, partying with friends, always doing those things, like engaging in addictive behaviors, it has an effect. So in that way, I would say, I don't know that it's trauma related, but I would say it's related. Well, I guess yes. That's the short answer.
Yeah.
Yes, I think
Yeah.
it is.
I understand that. I mean, it's interesting what we allow to be part of our lives when there's a part of us that says, this is not what it's supposed to be, but this is all that I know.
Yeah.
Like you said, I had no idea that what I was experiencing was abusive.
Yeah, I had no bar to measure by because it just was what it was.
Right.
Right.
And we do get addicted to that high energy, that adrenaline rush per se. And sometimes that's why people are in abusive relationships, because unbeknownst to them, they are addicted to that adrenaline rush.
Yeah, well, and people who are abusive, it was certainly this way with my dad, are very manipulative people. They know how to turn it on you so quick and make it your fault. And so it's really hard to get out of abusive relationships for that purpose.
Yeah.
And even on that, it's a miracle that, because had my mom stayed with him, she very well could have died herself, either through that story that I shared with that interaction of when my father was murdered, or at the hand of my father. Because that's another thing about abusers, is the longer you stay with particularly I'm talking about physical abuse, and I'm quoting this out of like psychology textbooks, but I'm no therapist.
Indeed.
But the psychology textbooks and research suggests that the longer someone is in a physically abusive relationship, the more desensitized their partner gets to the abuse as well as them, and that it's more and more likely that you will actually die at the hands of your abuser the longer that you're in the relationship with them.
Your dad passed away. Now you have a whole new world in front of you. Your adopted dad can adopt you. But also, my goodness, you're, 5.5, 6 years old and experiencing a first death?
Yeah, and an alarming one at that.
There's a certain energy that comes with the word murder.
Yeah, it's not a good one.
No.
It's not a good one. I have yet to meet anyone else in my own personal life that has told me that they have had someone murdered in their family. I'm the only one that I know, other than my mom, because that would have been her ex-husband, right?
Right.
And then other than my half-brothers, because it was their dad, other than that specific group of people, I've never met anyone else who has had that happen to them. And I say gratefully, good. Because it's not
something you would wish on anybody.
It's not something, right? Even with all the mixed emotions and that I had grieved my father's life more than his death and things like that, it's not something that really anyone should have to go through, right? No one should have to go through a loved one being taken from them in that way. It's hard enough, natural death.
Correct.
After someone's lived a full life, had many wonderful experiences with their loved ones, and then pass from natural cause, that's hard enough, let alone compounding losing someone
in violence
to someone else's hand is an extremely, extremely difficult circumstance to lose someone in, and very traumatic.
So being at this age, experiencing this, who did you look to? What tools or what guidance did you have to make it through that?
Great question. So I was really fortunate that I had a really good mom and then my adopted dad, right? Because of my own experience, I'm a firm believer that we get through things like grief and other trials, we get through them through other people. That's how we do it. There's only so much that we can do on our own. And eventually what we can do is not sufficient to overcome trial, any trial. And I found that to be the case in my own life, throughout my life, but certainly so and at this particular period. If I didn't have a good God-fearing mother, I'd be another statistic, you know, truly, you know, whether, but because I had my mom, she really pulled me through it, right? She was able to teach me. She was able to help me frame a lot of what I was going through in a healthy way, you know. And I can only imagine how now being a dad of a nearly 6-year-old my own self, I don't know what I would do to try and share those kinds of things with him, you know, like how?
Yeah.
But my mom was able to find a way and frame it in a way where I was able to cope and understand things in a healthy way that was productive and that was able to help me get through it. And so so I'm a firm believer that it's that way for any trial, but particularly with grief. I can't remember if I say this strongly in my book or not, but that with grief, we need other people to get through it. We can't do it on our own. But at the same time, it's a deeply personal journey that no one else can go through on your behalf.
Oh,
At the same time.
That is so profound.
You know.
You can't take it from anyone else. But
you have to go through it. No one's going to be able to flip the bill for you. This is a faith-based podcast, aside from Christ. You know, he can do it. But if you don't have strong faith in Christ, it's you, right? But again, we're fallible beings, and eventually we get through a point where we have to have support. We have to have someone. You know, anyone, even if it's a stranger. I can't tell you how many strangers have told me their story, you know, throughout my life. I can't tell you. And a fair few stick in my mind is, wow, I actually helped that person. Like, even all I did was listen, you know?
Yeah.
So even if it is a stranger, at some point in the journey to grief, you have to link arms with someone. You have to do it. You can't do it any other way. You know? Well, maybe some people could, but I couldn't do it any other way.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But yeah, it's a dichotomy that way.
So in that essence, you can possibly see how this traumatic experience has reformed you and given you opportunity to help someone else through that. And I can see that being your personality, where you would offer to go through something in essence because you could see that this would be beneficial for someone else and helping them to maybe avoid it or go through it.
I appreciate that. One thing that, it's true to say I would not be the same person if I didn't go through the trials that I did, particularly, really all my trials throughout life, because we all have them, but particularly those early childhood trials, I would not be the same person had I not undergone them. Because of having gone through those things, I can learn from others really easily, which is really nice. That's a skill that if others can develop is a very valuable skill, to be able to hear the stories of others and see how they've reacted. Again, because I was watching my dad. I was watching how he was living his life, and I saw how that ended up. Mm-hmm. So I learned, watch other people, watch what they do, listen to their stories, learn from them, and don't repeat stuff, right, that they go through.
Wow.
And so I was able to learn that because of that experience that I had. I also was able to learn the difference between right and wrong really early, like morality. I was able to learn morality really easy and really early on, because of the difference between my mother and my father, and then my adopted father and my biologic father. Because of that, those stark differences, I was able to learn really quickly this is good, this is bad.
Yeah.
You know, but on the same token, and I fight this now, it made me a very black and white person, which is sometimes something of value and sometimes not, you know. So I'm learning how to work through the times when it's not as of value. So that's another way that that's affected me as a person is just I can slip into being very black and white.
Yeah.
Again, that question, Travis, is this good? If there's no better way to solidify that black and white mentality, I don't know what, you know, I don't know what other experience you could have.
Yeah. So with that in mind, you have the people in your life that have helped you through it. What tools can you give to my listeners, per se, that maybe are faced with whatever grief it is? Maybe they've lost a spouse. Maybe they've found some information in their life that is affecting their family. What is some grief tools that you can share?
I'll share one that has been particularly impactful, and I do this all the time. I mean, I'm pretty sure my wife thinks that I'm a loon because of how often I do this one.
Okay.
But if you're going through something difficult, or if you're grieving or like down talking yourself in a difficult time,
Listening to the head trash, right?
yeah, something. I'm a strong advocate for role play, but like in yourself.
Okay.
So the idea is, if you catch yourself down talking, then you imagine yourself as if you're no longer talking to yourself, but you're talking to someone else going through the same thing as what you are. And then you say, would I say this to that other person? You know, and then you write down, okay, this is what I'm saying. And you say, is it productive? Is it helpful? No, it's not productive or helpful. Would I say that to someone else who is going through the exact same thing I'm going through? And then if the answer is no, then you stop and you role play what you would say to that person, audibly and verbally. Wow. You role play it. You say, this is what I would say to that person.
Yes, I can see that being so powerful.
And the reason why, and this is why I say my wife thinks I'm a loon, because of that audibly and verbally part, you know? Okay. I'm like standing in my bathroom getting ready, not necessarily affirmations, but I'll be like brushing my teeth. And then I'll stop brushing my teeth and I'll be like, so you know, blah, blah, blah. You know, and I'll go, and she's like over in the room, like, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, I was just role playing something. Right, but the reason why audibly and verbally helps is because it exercises a couple of different mechanisms, like kind of in your body and in your brain, that help to solidify it differently than if you were to just think it, right?
So speaking it gives it power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who
At least that's what I think.
Yeah.
I made it up. That's what I think.
You made it up.
Well, I'm sure I don't know. Well, it might be out there somewhere. But
what took you down that path of learning that? Because I think that a lot of us would have a different lifestyle if we learned to be kind to ourselves, to be tender. You know, like I know there was a coach that helped me through a tough thing that I went through. And she did say that is, would you hold that over a 5-year-old? Right? Why are you carrying that trauma and that guilt now as a 45-year-old looking at it as an adult concept? Why would you hold that guilt over a 5-year-old? I wouldn't.
No.
I wouldn't. So being able to do an audio dialogue like you talked about, I can see that being so powerful and healing.
Yeah, I think I came upon it because I'm an audible thinker. And thinking audibly helps me to cement topics, and telling my stories to people helps me to cement topics. And so in that, I'm just kind of naturally an audible thinker. I kind of came across it that way. But then another way that I came across it is prayer.
Okay.
That you know, that might be another way, instead of saying role play, for those that want to strengthen their faith in God at the same time, prayer is another thing, right? You pray that to the Lord. Right? And you say, hey, these are my thoughts, these are my feelings. You make them verbal, you make them audible, and then you say, and this is what I would prefer the narrative to be.
Yeah. And
then you make them verbal and you make them audible, right? So either of those tools is helpful. You know, if you're a little bashful and you don't know if your God wants to hear you talk to them in that way, then role play works, right?
Yeah.
That God will hear you. You know?
This is true.
Even if it's via the role play, they know what's going on in your life, whoever your deity may be. They'll hear you.
Yeah.
Right? Or again, the prayer, you know?
Well, and I think in taking care of yourself mentally, that is how you're able to show up in your family as a healthier person.
Yeah, and it affects those around us, right? So, like, if I chose to carry around this trauma, because to an extent, there's a choice there. Now, people who've been through extreme trauma, like I'm talking PTSD, like bombs blowing off and in a war like that, like there's certain triggers that they can't necessarily choose. They can't choose if a firework's going to go off at their neighbor's house.
Right.
You know, but that's going to, anyway. The point stands, in some cases, you can choose to the degree of which you engage with this trauma, right? And I just made the choice that I wasn't going to do it. You know? Now, not everyone is to the point in their journey where that's an option to them, and I realize that. And so I'm not saying that to gloat. I'm not saying that, oh, we'll just choose to not be traumatized. That's bad advice to take it that way.
Unattainable, depending on where you are.
But what you can do is you can try to get to a place where that might be a possibility. Right? And then if you work to get into that place where it might be a possibility to choose that you're not going to let this thing affect you anymore.
Yeah.
Just work to get to that point. Yeah. If you're not there yet, work for it. Right.
So I've recently been adopting something called write and burn. Have you heard of that?
I don't know that I have.
Okay. So the concept is to write everything down negative that's in your mind at that time.
And you toss it in here.
You eventually burn it.
Okay.
What I've been doing, because I use my iPad all the time, is that I will pull up just a canvas page and I'll write words that signify what I'm feeling at that time. And they can be as elementary as mad, sad.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Those kind of feelings.
Good, fair. Yeah.
And then I will start probably doing more of detailed writings of what it is that I'm feeling. But here's the thing, is that I'm not spell checking myself, which is a big deal.
You're not adding more to the pile, are you?
No, I'm not. No.
Good.
And actually, I'm not even paying attention to the margins of it. I'm just writing the word. I'm just getting it a name. I'm describing it so I can see it.
Yeah.
And then once I feel like I've gone through all of that, I'm listening, I'll ask, is there more? Is there more? And eventually I will feel that I have reached a point where there isn't any more. Now what I'm going to do is color. I'm going to color with whatever colors I feel like coloring. So I'm basically scratching out all those dirty words.
Coloring over it.
I am.
Yeah. Fun.
I just color back and forth, clean up the whole thing. And then I've been taking the eraser part and writing words that are opposite of the words that I wrote
in the color
down.
You're making it beautiful.
I'm cleaning it
That's
up.
cool.
I'm replacing it.
Yeah.
If I were doing the write and burn, I would have all of my dirty words on one piece of paper, and then I crush it up and I let it go. I use any of the energy that I need to get rid of it, and then I burn it. And there's something really, really delicious about the smell of those dirty words going up in flames.
Hopefully it doesn't smell like the dirty word.
That's right. No. Well.
But
also while I'm doing that, I do, because I'm a faith-based person, I let that be into Heavenly Father's hands. I send them into Heavenly Father's hands because they don't belong to me anymore.
So I'm gonna take a page out of your book.
Okay.
In trying to get through difficult things. You had mentioned earlier in one of your podcasts, actually you'd mentioned this about finding a spouse, right? You had talked about how you'd made space in your life for your husband.
Yes.
And that in comes Kels.
My future husband.
That's right, your future husband. And you already made space. And so it was a really easy transition. You were ready for it. You were open to it. So I'm going to take that, but I'm going to talk about making space for goodness in your life. Right? Because when we're in the midst of difficulty and trial, it is so easy to fill up any space where there might be goodness with trash, right?
Yes.
It's really easy to do. And so being very intentional. I mean, you had talked about clearing a space in your closet so that your Kels could have some room for his suits or whatever. Right? Clear some space in your metaphorical closet so when happiness and joy and goodness comes your way, you are ready to receive it. Right? You don't have to work to make room for it. You do that work before.
Yes.
So that way when it comes, it just slips right in there.
Yes.
Right? Anyway.
I love that. Yeah, and honestly, when we allow ourselves to do things like that physically and emotionally and spiritually, we're showing faith, aren't we?
Yeah. Yep. Faith in action.
Faith in action. Wow, Travis, thank you for sharing this time with us. Thank you for telling us about your vulnerable story of growing up. I think it's incredible what you have made it through. And thank you for being a light in this world and choosing to not be a bitter person, but let those experiences make you a better person.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for having me. This is the first time I've ever done it. Kind of fun. But thank you for giving me a platform to share some of my story because I feel it can be learned from. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
It has enriched your life, and it will enrich many of our lives as well as we embark on those kind of things. And speaking of which, how can my listeners find this incredible book?
Oh, you're not gonna let me get out without saying that.
No, I'm not.
I'm self-published, so I'm published on Amazon. So if you just go to Amazon and then just type in "Questions of the Soul" by Travis Nilsson, Nilsson, it'll pop up there. And then I'm also on Audible. I'm not the one narrating the book. I don't have the patience or skill set or tools. But I did get a really great narrator. I mean, so good. Well,
I know I can read through a book if it's on Audible.
Yeah. So it's on Audible and then ebook and then print book. So just whatever medium you prefer, it's in all of them.
And how can my audience reach you if they would like to have you on their podcast?
So I'm at victorybooksllc@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Thank you, Travis.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
If you've enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, share, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Instagram. Please comment because I would love to hear about what you think and what you want to see in the future. I'm no therapist, but I am your host, Stephanie Goodman.